Welcome, everybody, to our next session of Understanding the Bible. I'm John Fairless. It's my privilege to be the pastor of the Bronson Church of the United Methodist Church. And this is our course in which we're doing just what it says. We're trying to understand more about how the Bible was created, how it's put together, and how we can best learn to use it. This is the session that was conducted at Bronson United Methodist Church on February the 27th, 2019. Thank you to all of you who are viewing and using these materials to try to stay in touch and keep up. We're going to move pretty quickly tonight through our course. We are starting to sort of lay out a Bible timeline. It's called the Ark of Bible History. And you see here this sort of literally an ark. Sometimes I think of it as kind of a bridge that sort of takes us through the time period that the 66 books of the Bible cover. And you can see it begins on the left-hand side at the bottom with picture number 1. We're going to understand tonight. Each picture represents a major era in the time of the Bible, basically a time period. Now remember, the books of the Bible do not necessarily appear in chronological order. You don't begin with the first book, which is Genesis, and continue reading to the second book, the third book, the fourth book, and so on and so forth. And one book follows another. Genesis does begin at the beginning, and we're going to see tonight that very first section, the very first Ark of Bible History, is known for the main event, which is creation, the creation of the world. But otherwise, the books begin to skip around a little bit. So this is not a book-by-book chart. It is a timeline, and we will learn over the next few sessions where each of these different types and books of the Bible fit into this timeline. So let's break it out a little bit, and let's start with this very first Bible era. And you can see that picture number 1 helps us to remember that creation is the first Bible era. This does begin with the Bible's book of Genesis. And some of the main things we learn in this first time period, Adam is created and represents the first human in the Bible's creation story. We learned in class that Adam actually is a Hebrew word, Adam. It comes from the Hebrew word Adam-ah, which means the dirt or the ground. And in that opening story, this first human is taken from the dirt of the ground, Adamah. And when God breathes the breath of life into his nostrils, it says that he becomes Adam. We call him Adam in our modern day, but his name literally means from the dirt, from the dust. And so we have Adam. Eve is his wife. Her name means living. And of course, the text says that Eve became the mother of all living. We have the description of God dwelling with those first humans in this beautiful place known as the Garden of Eden. And it doesn't take long until that wonderful, some would say perfect life is interrupted by a visit from a serpent. And this, of course, is the story of the first temptation, the first decision by humans to turn away from the way of God, and that's why we call it the beginning or the entering of sin into the world. Sin grows throughout this first part of the Bible. Some pretty terrible things happen, and eventually God decides that the world needs a fresh start and is going to bring a flood to wash the world clean. It's a pretty difficult story when you think of the number of people and the number of creatures that died in that flood. But we also know that it's a picture of grace because God calls a man named Noah to build an ark and to preserve human life as well as animal life. One of the things we talked about in class was the fact that whenever there is judgment in the Bible, there is also a time or a space for repentance. God never pronounces a judgment without also showing grace. And that's a pretty cool thing to remember. At the end of the creation era, we have people building a tower which eventually becomes known as the Tower of Babel because God comes down and creates the differences in language. All of a sudden, people could not understand one another. They were trying to build a tower to heaven, trying to be like God. And that story closes with God reminding us we will never be able to be like God on our own. And so the creation era ends with the Tower of Babel. Basically, all of these stories happen in what we might call the time before time. What that means is they happen before recorded history. These stories are all not really possible for us to date. This is before humans began writing their history down. And so these first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis are sort of considered to be pre-history. But this makes up the first timeline, the first part of our timeline, creation. Let's take a look at the second era. This second era, the second part of the timeline, we have a nice picture here of a gentleman that looks like he's dressed in what we might imagine as sort of a Bible time costume, right? He's got kind of a turban on his head, and you can imagine his whole flowing coat. This is the time period known as the time of the patriarchs. Now, patriarch is a word for fathers. And this story begins with a man who's known as the father of the Hebrew nation. His name is Abraham. God calls Abraham to take a journey of faith, to leave his home, to leave his family, and to go to a place that God will show him. And God promises Abraham that God is going to do a great work in his life. He's going to make Abraham into a great nation, and that through Abraham and his descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So Abraham does follow God on this journey, and there are lots of adventures, but since we're just kind of covering the highlights, eventually Abraham has a son whose name is Isaac. Isaac, in turn, has a son whose name is Jacob. And through the course of his life, Jacob, let's just suffice it to say, he has some interesting encounters with God, and eventually his name is changed to Israel, a word that means struggles with God. And Jacob did indeed struggle with God in order to finally decide that he would live his life God's way. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered to be the founders of the nation of Israel. They are the patriarchs. Jacob, whose name is also Israel, has 12 sons, and each one of those sons is going to become responsible for building a tribe, for building a clan. And this is why later in the Bible we hear about the 12 tribes of Israel. It all got started in this next time period, this next era of the Bible, known as the time of the patriarchs. As we move ahead to the Bible timeline, the era that happens next, we move ahead by several hundred years to a time period known as the Exodus. You can see our picture here. Most of us, I think, would recognize that as a representation of the pyramids of Egypt. And this time period is associated with the nation of Egypt, as well as with a man by the name of Moses. God speaks to this man named Moses. And after a time period in his life where Moses' life is preserved, God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, where over a time period of about 400 years, they have moved from being residents of Egypt to being enslaved by the Pharaoh of Egypt. Times got really, really hard, and this part of the Bible tells us that the people began to cry out to God for deliverance. And so God sent them this man named Moses, who does indeed lead them out of the promised land, out of Egypt. The word Exodus means come out. It's a journey out. And so this time period is known as the time when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt on an exodus. During this part of the timeline, God gave Moses the Ten Commandments while Moses came up to the mountain of God. After that, the Israelites, well, they're just like us. They're kind of hard-headed. And they decided they would make up their own mind. The Israelites rebelled against the ways of God. They refused to follow God's leading in entering what God had promised to Abraham all those years ago, a promised land. And so instead, God allowed them to wander in the desert for 40 years. Pretty much every adult that came out of the land of Egypt ended up passing away before the 12 tribes of Israel actually got to move into the promised land. This part of the Bible might speak to us about how important it really is to try to listen to God and to follow God's way, else we might find ourselves sort of wandering in our own kind of wilderness. Finally, the last part of our session for this week was the fourth period in the Bible, the fourth Bible era, which becomes known as the time of Conquest. That is a picture of two crossed swords on our Ark of Bible History. And this was a time where the children of Israel, as they began to move into this promised land, did find themselves fighting some battles. Joshua is the main leader for this time. He was a young man who helped Moses, and after Moses passes away, it's up to Joshua to lead the nation into this promised land. And so these 12 tribes of Israel move into the land and discover that they are going to need to fight for their lives and that they're going to need to take some of the cities by force. By and large, God blesses them. Certainly, God always blesses them when they listen to God's will. There are some stories in this time period where the people of Israel still decide that, well, maybe they could try a couple of things their way. And those are stories where the conquest doesn't go so well. But eventually, the entire promised land is possessed by the Israelites. They are settled into sort of a loose confederation of clans, each clan named for one of the 12 sons of Jacob, or one of his descendants. Each has their own part in the land. They're not really joined together yet as a nation. They don't really have a single ruler, and that's where we're going to begin picking up the story next time. But on this final portion here, we see that it is the time of conquest under Joshua as a leader. And we at least get all of those 12 tribes of Israel moved into the same land. Well, let's put that Bible arc back up. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, we're through the first 4 time periods, and we've covered several hundred, actually more than 1,000 years of Bible history at this point. But you can see we've got quite a ways to go. And in the sessions that will be coming up, In the next few weeks, we'll be filling in the rest of these pictures and the rest of the blanks in our Ark of Bible History. For today, remember that the first era is known as, have you got it? Creation. The second era is the time of the patriarchs. The third era is the one that is known as the Exodus out of Egypt. And finally, our fourth era is the time period known as the Conquest. Just giving you a little time to get that work done on your own. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with our next session of Understanding the Bible. Welcome, everybody, to our next session of Understanding the Bible.